Okay, moving on, we can look at the images over in the right-hand column, and they are pretty close together. They don't really have a lot of space between them. So I can, in this case, target the image selector. So over in my CSS, I'm going to go ahead and add the element selector for the images, which is img. Following syntax, I open my curly braces, and we're going to go ahead and add a margin dash bottom of also 20 pixels to match the space that we had between the paragraphs, or excuse me, the articles in the other section. And looking at the articles, I don't think 1% is quite enough padding. I feel like the text is still too close to the edges, so I'm going to go back in and change that to 4%. I think that looks a little bit better. At this point, use everything that you've learned to go ahead and make different style choices. I'm going to go ahead and just do a couple of different things. You don't have to do these, but just to give you an idea of what's possible. So right off the bat, I want to give a little bit more visual separation between the header, the main, and the footer. So I'm going to go ahead and add a border at the bottom of the header and a border at the top of the footer. So here back at the header selector in my CSS file, I'm going to add border dash bottom, and I'm going to shorthand this. I'm going to do 2 pixels, solid, and I'm just going to do black. I know I want something similar to the footer. I'm going to copy that property and value set and go down to the footer. Don't forget to add your semicolons in. Sometimes I am going past that pretty quickly because we've already learned that, but don't forget, at the end, if you're going to add another property and value set, you have to have that semicolon. And then I don't want this at the bottom of the footer, I want it at the top, so I'm going to change border to top. Look over and actually place my cursor outside so I can look over and see at the bottom of my header I have a black line, and at the top of my footer I have a black line. I also could have added a border to the top and bottom of just main instead. Both ways would work. Okay, continuing on, I think we're just about ready to move on to formatting our text. So you might think it looks fine right now, but it's just plain, it's basic. It's, most of it's not okay. I mean, look at our H1 here in the header. It's shoved into the top left. So again, these are all these things that you're looking for. You're finding all these details and then taking it further. Don't just stop and say, okay, I'm done. You want to make sure that you're actually looking and seeing and finding ways that you can make it better. A good next step would to go ahead and change our font family. So for that, I'm going to use Google Fonts. If you haven't watched that video already, go back to the itinerary and watch how to use Google Fonts, because I'm just going to quickly go through it now. And when you're going to apply your fonts, you want to think of the global fonts that you want to use and the local fonts that you want to use. What I mean by that is you think about what type of font is going to be covering the most text content in your document. So I'm looking here at my preview and I can see that most of my text content is what's known as body text. This paragraphs of text here, this is body text. There's a lot of it. And as I continue a website, there will be even more. So that is thinking globally. I'm not going to go to each paragraph and assign a font family. What I'm going to do is say, okay, this is the largest amount of text, so I'm going to go to my oldest ancestor, my body, and give the body a font family, and everything nested inside the body will take on that font family until you override it. So I'm basically applying one font family to everything and then going in and fine tuning and changing the font family for each of my headings. Or in this case, I'll actually show you we're going to apply the same font family to each of our headings in the same selector. So first thing is to globally apply a font family to the body. All right, so I'm gonna go back to my browser and go to Google Fonts. I already said I've got my fonts all chosen. And I have my Google Fonts ready to go, but I need to add the code. So first I'm going to grab the link. That goes in the head of my HTML document. So back over in brackets, I'm going to go to my HTML, go up into the head, and here I can see the link to my CSS. So I'm going to go to the end of that, hit a return, and paste in that link to the Google Fonts. Then I can go back over to my CSS and I can apply the CSS rules, which if I go back over to Google Fonts, I have both of them here. And if you want to make it easier on yourself, you can go ahead and copy those. I'm going to hide that browser. And I'm going to go here to the end of my CSS and paste those in really quick. That is just the property and value set that I can use in a selector. So pasting that in right now, it's doing nothing because I have not given them to any selector. So I did that because I want them to be different. So this first sans serif, this is the font I chose because it's very readable, and you want your body text to be very readable. You don't want it to be a fancy text or a very elaborate text. Otherwise, once it's smaller and there's a lot of it, it's hard to read. So I chose an easier sans serif font. I'm going to go ahead and actually Command X to get rid of that. And thinking globally, I'm going to give that to my body selector. So here I need to add my semicolon, and then I can paste in that rule. So I have font family, my open sans serif. And if I look over at my preview, I can see it has now been applied to all of my text content. That is thinking globally. But I want a bit of visual variance between my body text and my headings. And usually you do. You usually want your body text and each of your headings to be slightly different so that you can glance through and very quickly see the hierarchy of your document. So now that I've globally added that font family, I'm going to start up at my H1. And now I'm going to take this slightly fancier font family. It's just a little bit more decorative. And I'm going to apply that to each of my headings. My heading 1, my heading 2s, and my heading 3s. So I could do those individually in 3 separate selectors, one for H1, one for H2, one for H3, but you can combine selectors. When you have the same property and values that you want to give to multiple selectors, you can combine them. To do that, I go ahead and type in the first one, H1, then add a comma and a space, then H2, comma, space, H3. Then I just continue with my normal syntax. Open my curly braces, and I'm going to go ahead and Command V to paste in that font family. And if I look over at my preview, I now see all of my headings have taken on that kind of more decorative font, which because they are larger, it doesn't matter. It's still readable even though it's so decorative. Now I'm ready to break those apart and style them individually. So now starting with my H1, I'm going to think about what I want to do to it. So right now, following browser defaults, it is shoved in the top left corner. This is the heading 1. This is the branding. This is the intro to my website. So we're being really basic right now. One thing I might want to do is just center this in the header both vertically and horizontally. It's harder than it sounds, You do them separately, the vertical and the horizontal, and there's some extra steps you have to do for the vertical centering. So there is a walkthrough in the itinerary on centering one line of text, both vertically and horizontally, if you need a reminder later. It's going to cover exactly what we're about to do right now. Okay, so that is the H1 that I want that to happen to, that I want to center. But in this case, I'm going to add code to its parent, which is the header. So I am going to scroll back up and find the header selector. I never need to add additional selectors with the same name. So if I already have a header selector, I don't create another one to add more code. I just go and find the one that I already created and add to it. So here's the header. I'm going to go here to the border bottom, add my semicolon, and to center horizontally, it's quite simple. I just use the property of text align and set the value to center. So text dash align colon and add my value of center. All right, perfect. It's centered horizontally, but now I want to center it vertically. There's another property for that. It is called vertical dash align. And the property for that is not center, it's middle. So here we go, middle. Add my semicolon and hit enter. And if I look at my preview right now, I can see it didn't do anything. Vertical dash align middle will not do anything until you also add more code. And you'll run into times where this is the case. And you just have to think through and kind of understand the things that you're going to do and not freak out when something like that happens. So vertical align middle didn't do anything. I have to think back to how do I actually do this. So with vertical align, you have to add additional code. First, you look at the height of the header. It is 200 pixels. Then you add in a property called line dash height, and that line height needs to be equal to or greater than the height of that parent element. So I'm going to do line height 200 pixels. And if you want it perfectly centered vertically, you do want it to be equal. So line height is 200 pixels. And now if I go ahead and look over, I see my Flying Kittens heading 1 is centered both vertically and horizontally. Okay, it also needs to be the most prominent text on my website. It's the H1. I need to maintain that hierarchy. So I'm going to also add in a different font size. So with this, I'm going to use responsive measuring unit of M. And if you don't understand what I'm doing right now, you need to go back and watch that video refer to that lesson on measuring units that we did a couple weeks ago. But basically, if you don't set the global font size, it is then based on the browser default. And the browser default for text is 16 pixels. So I could go and set a global font size in the body element. Let's say I add in font dash size 16 pixels. If I look over at my preview, nothing happened. That is because that's already the browser default for font size. I can do that or not. But when working with M's, you always first set that global font size with pixels or leave it to browser default. Then you can use M's throughout the rest of your selectors. M's are always based on that global size that you set first. Then it's based on how many times you want to increase that size. So, for example, my H1. I don't have a selector for the H1 yet, so I'm going to go ahead and create it. H1. I'm going to set my font size, and let me give a little bit of room here to bring this up further. Just make sure you can see it a little better. Font size. All right, I'm going to go with 3M. Actually, I'm going to do 4M. And if I look at my preview, I can see that I've increased my H1 font size quite a bit. And that 4M, that basically is saying 4 times whatever the global font size is set at. If I look up here, my global font size is 16 pixels. 16 times 4 is 64. So even though that says 4Ms, it is showing as 64 because it's times that base. The font size up here, like I said, that's a browser default anyway. If I, want 16 pixels, I don't even need to have that code. I can clean it up. Doesn't need to be there. I'm going to Command Z. I just want to show you really quickly what would happen if you change that to something else. So let's say my font size globally is going to be set to 32 pixels. Now my H1 is 4 times 32 instead of 4 times 16. So my font size is now quite a bit larger. I actually like how big that made my H1, but I don't like how big it made everything else. So I'm going to go back and use browser default. I'm going to take away that global size out of the body, but because I did like it bigger, I'm going to go here to the H1 and increase my M's. I increase that to 8 M's. I like how large that is. Since I'm not adding anything else, it might as well be very prominent on the page. Next, I'll move on to my H2 and add a selector for my H2s. And it's an element selector, so it's going to affect all my H2s. I'm going to go ahead and increase the font size. For this, I'm going to do maybe 3 M's. I don't like how big that is. I'm going to go to 2.5 M's. Something to notice is that I sometimes will say M's, but I'm not coding M's. It's just EM, there's no S on it. So 2.5 EM. Also, I want to add a font color, so I can't forget my semicolon. And remember that with font color, it's not font dash color, it's just color. So then I want to add in one of the colors from my color theme. And I'm going to go with this darker orange here. Paste that in. And I can see that now that H2 is taking on that other color. I'm going to move on to my H3s. So H3. Give them a font size. I'm going to do 2M. Whoop. For my H3s. Then give them a different color. So color. And I'll come over here and grab a color. Add that in. And let's just talk about that for a second. So you always want a lot of contrast between the font color and the background color. So if your background color is light, you want a medium to dark font. If your background color is dark, you want a medium to light font, usually going towards the extremes. The reason for that is you want your website to be as accessible to as many people as possible. And as people age, and even sometimes when you're not that old, we all see colors a little bit differently. We all are able to see contrast a little bit different. The more contrast you have between your font color and your background color, the easier it is to read. So if you want your website to be accessible to everybody, then your font color, if it's light, it needs to be on a dark background. And if your font color is dark, it needs to be on a light background. There's a little bit of wiggle room in there, but you never want to do a kind of dark font on a dark background. It's really hard to see and really hard to read. Might not be to you, but you have to think about your users and how many different people you have to cover. So here with my like kind of greenish background and this pink color, pink orangish, that's a little close. If my font size wasn't so big, that would be even harder to read. For some people, this might still be hard to read. I'm just gonna leave it there for now. But my yellow color that is about the same tone as that of my H2s is easier to read because it's on that white, even though it's actually smaller than the H2. So those are just things you want to keep in mind. Your body text, you always want to make sure that it is as readable as possible. You want to make sure that it's not a fancy font. You want to make sure that it's big enough but not too big. You want to make sure that it isn't stretched too far. If you stretch your text across your entire website, it's really hard to read a line of text that long. That's why when I gave you this, I actually made the sections a little bit smaller so that those lines of text aren't so long. Ideally, your lines of text you want to keep around 166 characters, give or take, but that's the average that is easiest to read. Okay, so now taking a look at some things, my H2 up here is quite a bit further over to the left than my others, and I always want to kind of keep things aligned in a grid. So that is a little bit off. So I'm going to go back to that H2 and add some padding. I'm going to add maybe let's see how 2% is. Really, I need to look and see how much I added up here. So I added 4%. Sometimes I add 2. So 4%, and now I can see, all right, my H2 up here is aligned with my H3 and my body text. Keep that all aligned. What else? Let's add a border around the H2. So right now I'm just adding possibilities. You don't have to do this, but maybe I want to add a border, 2 picks, dotted, and black. Just kind of, again, giving some separation between the other content. Now it stands out a lot more than it did before. What else should we do? Let's see. And once again, don't worry that the images aren't lined up with the text at this point. Again, if I bring my browser in and out, the way that we're doing it is going to allow those to shrink up and down. We'll learn a better way a little bit later.